This video is for the last page of notes for lesson 10.7, and it discusses the inverse function of trig functions. Now, when you have a right triangle, if the angles in a triangle add up to 180, then if that's 90, these two angles must be acute. And the acute angles mean less than 90 degrees. If any one of those angles was more than 90 degrees, then we could not form a triangle. So basically, a property of right triangles is that the other two angles left, besides the right angle, are acute angles. And we can find those two angles by using inverse trig functions. And by inverse, we're talking about opposite. So for example, if you talk about times, the inverse operation of times is division. If you talk about addition, the inverse operation of addition is subtraction. They undo each other. The inverse operation of square rooting is squaring, and so on. So how do you find an angle instead of, before we were finding, we were taking the sine, cosine, or tangent of an angle and getting a decimal. Now we're going to go the other way. So that's called the opposite operation. In other words, the inverse sine, inverse cosine, and inverse tangent. And on your calculators, the notation for that is basically a little power of -1. So if we look at that, now you have sine of sine to the -1 power, cosine to the -1 power, and tangent to the -1 power. And those are right above the sine, cosine, and tangent buttons. So in other words, you have to push the second function key to get to it. And basically, it just goes the other way. So if we take an example for 9, what we're looking at is to find out, to solve this for v, I would take tan inverse of tan v, and I would do that to both sides. And what happens is, like we said, they're opposite operations, so tan inverse and tan cancel. So you're left with v equals tan inverse of 0.8098. And basically then you just type in your calculator, you go second function tan, your tangent button, type in 0.0898, and you should get approximately 39. Now that represents the degree. Okay, so we're going backwards and getting the degrees now, and we'll see more questions like that in a moment. So that's longhand. So really, to solve this number 10 here, all we have to do is take and say u is equal to the sine inverse of 0.3420. And when we do that, we should get 20 degrees. Next one, same scenario. W will equal cosine inverse of 0.9135. So W equals approximately 24 degrees. And they asked us, I didn't read this in the directions, but they asked us to round to the nearest degree. All right, so let's go backwards here, or go to an applied question here, going backwards. And we have now the need to find the angle, unlike in the other parts. So which one do we use? Well, we have these choices. Sine, cosine, and tangent, SOHCAHTOA. Now if you look at the picture closely, we are given the hypotenuse, and if we're looking from this angle, this would be considered the adjacent side. So what trig function gives us adjacent and hypotenuse? It's not sine, it's not tangent. So we would set this one up by saying cosine of A, we usually use capital letters here, equals its ratio, adjacent over hypotenuse, which is 18 over 21. And we can find that by just taking So A will equal cosine inverse, and you can just type in your calculator 18/21 in parentheses, and that should give you approximately 31 degrees. You're going to work on your calculators here to make sure you can get the proper answer, because we don't want to do it incorrectly. And our calculators are good tools, but we have to know how to use them. So here's an angle we're looking for. This is the hypotenuse, which we don't have. This would be considered the opposite, and this would be considered the adjacent. So we have sine is opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, and tangent is opposite over adjacent, so SOHCAHTOA. So what do we have? We have opposite and adjacent. So tangent. So we would say tangent of the unknown is equal to opposite over adjacent, and we can solve this by taking the tan inverse of 16/31. And that should give us approximately 27 degrees. Our last two questions. In this last one, we actually have quite a few choices because we are given the hypotenuse. We're given, if we're looking from here now, we're given the opposite and the adjacent. So you could pick any of them. So I'm just going to default to sine. Sine of, I'm going to call this angle A, is equal to opposite, which is 36, over hypotenuse, which is 85. So A is equal to sine inverse of 36/85. So A would be approximately 25 degrees. Our last question here, we have to draw a picture. We're talking about a ramp forms an angle with the ground of 25 degrees. The ramp is 6 feet tall. What's the length of the ramp to the nearest tenth, which is 0.1? That's 1 decimal place. And here is the ramp. That's also the hypotenuse. Here's your right angle with the height with respect to the ground. So if you look at what we're given, if we're looking from this angle, we're given the opposite side, and we're looking for the hypotenuse. So if we have SOHCAHTOA, we have opposite and hypotenuse, which would mean sine. So sine of 25 equals opposite over hypotenuse, which we don't know. Now I'd like to solve this, unlike Mr. Bombeck's version. I'd like to make a proportion, and then all I need to do is cross multiply. So I would get h times sine of 25 equals 6 times 1, which is 6. I would divide both sides by sine, and I would have 6 divided by sine of 25. And that should give us approximately 14.2, they said round to the nearest tenth, and that would be in feet. And this ends the last part of lesson 10.7.